Dunvegan Castle, Isle of Skye. Formerly accessible only from the sea by means of a gateway with a portcullis opening on the rocks, and now having an entrance over a bridge across a ravine which once served as a moat. This historic castle, with walls in places 10 feet thick, stands amid delightful gardens, in sharp contrast to the rugged wildness of its surroundings. From time immemorial, the castle has been the seat of the MacLeod of MacLeod, and the early 13th century clan stronghold is visited by MacLeods from all over the world. Dunvegan is claimed to be the oldest castle in Scotland, still inhabited by the original family. At first sight, this venerable edifice does indeed look, as Dr. Samuel Johnson put it, as if it had been let down from heaven by the four corners to be the residence of a chief. It dominates the village at the head of Loch Dunvegan, and the famous ferry bridge has long had an evil reputation. For years it was said that no horse could cross the bridge without shying. The castle contains a host of interesting and historical objects, including relics of Prince Charles Edward, letters from Dr. Johnson and Sir Walter Scott referring to their respective visits in 1773 and 1815, and Jacobite and St. Kilda mementos. There is also the Dunvegan cup, made of Irish bog oak, the drinking horn of Rory Moore, Sir Roderick MacLeod, the 12th century chief, knighted by King James VI, and in the ferry room in the South Tower, the fascinating ferry flag of mysterious origin. This banner was credited with the power to bring victory to the clan that waved it, to make fruitful the marriage bed of a MacLeod chief who spread it on the nuptial couch, and to charm herrings and other edible fish into the loch when it was unfurled. One condition of its effectiveness and victory is that the flag can only be waved on 3 occasions, and so far it has been used twice, in 1490 at the Battle of Glendale, and in 1580 at Trumpan. On both occasions the MacLeods were the victors. Legend has it that the flag was given to the MacLeods by a member of the fairy fraternity, who in the guise of a mortal woman married a member of the clan, the gift being made at the ferry bridge which stands nearby. Dunwich Heath. Dunwich. I apologize. There's a W in it. Dunwich Heath, Suffolk. South of Dunwich, along these acres of sandy cliffs, there have been heard, it is said, the ghost bells of churches long since submerged, and there is also, it seems, a ghostly Victorian squire riding a ghostly Arab thoroughbred. The squire is a member of the wealthy Barn family, who in Victorian days owned nearby Sutterley Hall, and some 3,000 acres in the region of Dunwich. Miles Barn was a splendid horseman and bred Arab horses, exercising them on Dunwich Heath and elsewhere in all weathers, attired in a tall white hat. During the First World War, soldiers billeted hereabouts reported seeing the ghost of an old squire riding on a ghostly horse, a beautiful beast with proudly arched neck and magnificent tail, totally different from their troop horses. Over the succeeding years, there have been sporadic reports of such a mounted figure being seen in the area, most often when the moon is full or on the wane. A silent figure that passes proudly along the heathland and disappears among the sandy cliffs. Here, too, in this eerie place, the ghost of an unidentified Elizabethan lady has been seen walking down towards the sea and disappearing. Old Dunwich now lies buried beneath the waves, once a prosperous city, possessing no less than 9 churches, a bishop's palace, a mint and immense bronze gates of great antiquity. It was a seaport of power and significance. Now all is gone, borne away by the ceaseless erosion of the sea. The phantom bells, for some reason, are most often reported just before Christmas, and frequently late at night. Nearby Grey Friars has a legend of lost love. Here a maid and a local son of the lord of the manor fell in love, and used to meet secretly and walk together among the sandy dunes. The noble family found out what was happening. Forbidden to meet his love, the young man died of a broken heart, and his ghost still wanders along the beach, amid the heathland, leaving no footprint in the sands. Dunwich is one of the areas in East Anglia known as the haunt of Black Shuck, the phantom black hound that goes padding across the desolate countryside, his coat black as ebony, his eyes burning like live coals. All imagination, you say? More likely a disordered digestion, a hallucination or trick of the light and shade. Tell that to the local people. Many claim to have seen the fearsome hound, and have no wish to bring back the memory of talking about it. If you don't choose to believe them, well, that's your affair. East Riddlesden Hall, West Yorkshire. This manor house, typical of the district, has been discolored by centuries of industrial grime, but otherwise looks much as it must have done when it was completed in 1692. The great barn in the grounds is much older than the hall, and is in fact one of the finest medieval barns in the north of England. There are several ghosts here from different periods of history. First, there is the Grey Lady, a female form attired in grey, that has been seen flitting aimlessly along corridors and in and out of bedrooms, seemingly without object or destination, but very much a part of the atmosphere of the house. The administrator, Major W.D. Morris Barker, tells me this is the ghost of one of the ladies of the manor, and the story goes that her husband returned home one day to discover his wife with her lover. Not wishing actually to shed blood, he kindly decided to lock his wife in her room and then promptly bricked up the boyfriend. Consequently, of course, they both starved to death, and her ghost is said to mount the stairs, walk along the landing, and enter the master bedroom. An old lady who was caretaker at the hall many years ago used to see the Grey Lady quite regularly. She became quite used to seeing her and could minutely describe the dress she wore. She was rather annoyed with the Grey Lady because it seems that although she was always greeted and said hello to her, the Grey Lady never replied. Major Morris Barker adds, "We have never seen the Grey Lady, but both my wife and I and our family have heard footsteps on the stairs and landing on a number of occasions, and 3 times a disembodied voice has bade me good night from the top of the stairs." Another ghost, Major Morris Barker tells me, is known as the Head at the Window. This is reputed to be the ghost of the lover of the Grey Lady, and his head is supposed to appear at the rose window in the room where he was bricked up. The son, now elderly, of a former caretaker here tells me that many years ago this room was in fact bricked up, and when it was broken into, a male skeleton was found. A third ghost, known as the White Lady, is supposed to be the ghost of another of the ladies of the manor. This time, our White Lady had been out riding or hunting on the estate, and was seen to enter the gates on her return. However, only the horse arrived at the house, and although a search was made, she was never seen again, and it is thought that the horse perhaps shied, threw her into the lake, and she drowned. Her ghost is said to be walking around the lake. Then there is the ghost coachman. The horse of the coach he was driving is said to have shied for some unknown reason and bolted, pulling the coach into the lake. The coachman was drowned, and his ghost is said to be walking across the lake, presumably looking for his coach. Yet another ghost of East Riddlesden Hall is known as the Highlander. His ghost, according to some reports, is seen peering through the circular window over the front porch. According to other accounts, he walks up the drive leading to the hall, or more rarely, walks leisurely around the old fish pond at dusk. It could be that some of the ghosts have been incorrectly identified, but that ghosts do walk here seems indisputable. The story of the Highlander ghost tells of a Scottish wool buyer, or some say a packer, who had attended a market at Bingley in the 18th century, when the owner of the hall was one of the richest men in the area. Riches made in the rag trade. But the nefarious deeds of the master of the hall were apparently legion throughout the district. It was even believed by the local peasants that the lordly river heir, disgusted at the practices and carryings on at the hall, changed its course as a protest. But still the wily and wealthy owner of East Riddlesden looked out over the river, enjoying the spectacular views from some of the 280 windows in the house. The Scotsman, carrying a great deal of money on his person, either for the purpose of purchasing wool or the result of a good day's trading, whichever story you may prefer, was caught in a blizzard and sought shelter at the hall. He was taken upstairs by the steward and shown into the small room over the front door, and soon afterwards coldly murdered, and his body buried secretly at dead of night. There are various stories of the murder, and some say that the Scotsman was in debt to the master of Riddlesden Hall, and that the steward acted on the orders of his master. Others have it that the steward had caught sight of the large amount of money he carried and acted on his own initiative. At all events, an account of the subsequent trial and hanging of the steward is on record at York for the year 1790. Whatever the truth of the matter, the ghost of the unfortunate Scotsman seems to have lingered here, making irregular appearances at the most unexpected times. On the other hand, another apparently paranormal manifestation at East Riddlesden Hall consists of the rocking of a carved wooden cradle in one of the bedrooms, and this is said to take place each New Year's Eve. The 17th century cradle is that used by generations of previous owners and occupants of the hall, and it stands in the master bedroom. Each New Year's Eve, I am told, the cradle has been seen to rock, and to contain a ghost baby. And it has been suggested that Riddlesden's ghostly grey lady is responsible for the rocking. Perhaps she is looking for the cradle when she is seen wandering about the house throughout the year, and for some unknown reason only finds it on New Year's Eve. Major Morris Barker tells me, I have popped up to this room at various times of the night on 2 New Year's Eves, but I have not seen anything to date. It could be, of course, that my timing was wrong. One recent ghost book mentions a ghostly figure of a middle-aged lady in a grayish-blue dress that frequents part of the garden. Her gown long enough to trail on the ground, although it is noticed that when she passes over lawn or flowers there is no movement of either, and it has been observed that she casts no shadow, which is surely hardly surprising. A final word from Major Morris Barker. Although we seem to have a lot of ghosts for a smallish property, I personally do not see anything odd about this in view of the fact that there has been a dwelling here for well over 1,000 years. Quite apart from this, the site has certain mystical features about it. It lies on a ley line in the dividing line of 2 Saxon wapentakes, the Staincliff and Skyrack, passes directly through it, and the site had certain sacred connotations inasmuch as it is reputed to stand on a hill with a river flowing beneath it. Saxon and probably pre-Saxon chiefs would meet here to pass laws and punish wrongdoers. The past seems to overlap the present at Riddlesden Hall. Felbrigg Hall, Norwich, Norfolk. This is a fine 17th century house with a wealth of 18th century furniture and pictures. A walled garden, woodland, and lakeside walks, and a haunted library. The first Earl of Norfolk took the name de Felbrigg, adopted it as the name of his manor, and built the first house on the site. Some medieval arches and doorways still remain in the cellars of the present noble hall. The estate passed into the hands of wealthy merchant John Wyndham and his son Sir John, who married Margaret Howard, whose father became Duke of Norfolk in 1483, and was knighted by Henry VIII. Sir John was eventually beheaded on Tower Hill in 1502. A later member of the family, Mad Wyndham, became notorious for his passion for trains, persuading railway officials strictly against regulations to allow him to drive engines, collect tickets, and wear a guard's uniform. Towards the end of his life, he may have achieved some kind of happiness when, totally bankrupt, he became the driver of the express train that ran between Norwich and Cromer at wages of a guinea a week. After his death, the house, contents, park, woodland, and farmland were acquired by John Ketton, a successful Norwich merchant who had made a fortune out of cattle feed in the 1830s and 40s. He and his Quaker wife loved the house and made very few alterations. 13 years after Ketton's death in 1872, author, traveler, and collector of ghostly legends Augustus Hare visited Felbrigg and saw the two Miss Kettons. They seemed to have adopted the Wyndhams and all their heirlooms and traditions, as though they were their own ancestors, and in particular they were convinced that William Wyndham, a man who had made many alterations in the library and added to it many valuable volumes, still visited the house and especially the library in ghostly form. The fine library at Felbrigg was described by a visitor as long ago as 1795 as well furnished with the most valuable authors. The large Gothic library table, a pair of green leather armchairs, the 3 splat-backed chairs, and the celestial and terrestrial globes, all must have been familiar to William Wyndham II, as familiar, perhaps, as the books he loved and collected for his family library. These included large folios on architecture and classical antiquities, which he brought back with him after his prolonged grand tour of 1737 to 42. His copy of Goffcourt's Traité de la Religion, which stimulated a practical interest in bookbinding, and the manuscript Raganjaw, a short satirical play written by David Garrick and dedicated to William Wyndham in 1746. Wyndham also owned a large collection of bookbinding tools and materials, and in the library there are some 300 quarter-bound calf volumes thought to be his work. Small wonder that he is popularly believed to have so loved his books and his library that even in death it could not separate him from them. During the course of his visit to Felbrigg in 1885, Augustus Hare was told by one of the Miss Kettons, "Mr. Wyndham comes every night to look after his favorite books in the library. He goes straight to the shelves where they are. We hear him moving the tables and chairs about. We never disturb him, though, for we intend to be ghosts ourselves one day, and to come about the place just as he does." It is hoped that it is not the Mrs. Ketton who are responsible for the ghostly smells of rotting flesh that have been reported in recent years from Felbrigg Hall. I hesitate to dwell on anything so repulsive as this strange smell, but the fact, as reported to me by more than one National Trust official, is that in the past, undoubtedly, there has been an unexplained smell, limited in scope to an area of no more than a few feet within a passageway, a smell which has sometimes been noticeable on the ground floor and on other occasions in a certain upstairs corridor, but most often not at all. It was emphasized to me that many investigations were carried out, and as far as could be established, the occasional smell was not due to drains or had any logical explanation. The smell was sickly sweet and very strong, and most people who encountered it said it was a smell they would have associated with rotting flesh. David F. Musson, B.S., is presently Regional Director of the National Trust Southern Region. For some years he was at Felbrigg Hall, and he has been kind enough to send me an account of his experience. He prefaces this by saying, "I should state that I am not really a believer in ghosts, but that might just make what I have to say more interesting. During December 1969, the last squire of Felbrigg Hall, Wyndham Ketton Kremer, died, leaving the house and all its contents, together with the park and estate, to the National Trust. The house was absolutely full of a magnificent collection of ephemera of many kind. I had just moved to the East Anglian region, and was given the responsibility of sorting out the financial situation, taking over the property, and opening the house to the public. This involved examining the contents of every drawer and trunk, as well as all the nooks and crannies on the estate. One winter's afternoon, at about 5 o'clock, I was working in the library on the first floor of the house, sorting through the contents of the library desk. Light was fading fast, and it was a very cold afternoon. I had an electric fire close beside me. The only lighting was a standard lamp and a table lamp. I was engrossed in my sorting work when I suddenly became aware of the feeling that someone else was in the room, and I looked up to see a gentleman sitting in an armchair in front of the fireplace, apparently reading a fat leather-bound book. I did not react immediately, and carried on with my work, before it dawned on me that there was no one else in the room. I looked up again. The gentleman was still sitting there, but gradually faded from view. The experience was in no way worrying. Later I asked the butler to the late squire whether there had ever been a ghost in the library. He said, "Oh, yes. The ghost of William Wyndham has regularly been seen sitting in the armchair on the far side of the fireplace reading a book. He always likes to read one of the collection of Samuel Johnson's personal library, which he bought for the Felbrigg Hall Library, and we keep 2 or 3 volumes from this collection on the table by the chair." As far as I know, the ghost has not been seen subsequently, perhaps because on security grounds, with the room being open to the public, we have had to lock up the valuable books which William Wyndham found so interesting. I myself had some doubts as to the identity of the gentleman in question, and that he was dressed in a very ordinary-looking suit, which was not what I would have expected from someone occupying the house in the 1750s and 60s. However, my doubts on this score were completely overruled when, after many months of attempts, we managed to get into one of the trunks in the attic at Felbrigg, in which we found wrapped in newspapers of the 1830s 3-piece suits of the 1750s and 60s, remarkable in being ordinary day-to-day wear rather than special event clothing. These clothes were very ordinary and would hardly have drawn attention to the wearer had they been put on at the present time. There is a further mysterious twist to the story which I do not fully understand, nor am I sure of the details. After I left Felbrigg in 1975 to become regional director of the southern region, I heard that one of the portraits of William Wyndham, which had been painted in his youth on a grand tour of Italy, had an inscription on the back of the frame which apparently said something in Italian to the effect that his spirit would return to his home. He was not to die, however, for a considerable number of years. There is a further ghost story relating to Felbrigg, quite different in character. It was told to me by a previous agent of the estate, John Mottram, if I remember correctly. Apparently the late squire was dining with his younger brother, Dick, and a friend of their own age, Dick Bagnall Oakley, probably in the early 30s, when all three were young men. As I remember it, they had left the dining table and were sitting in front of the fireplace with a glass of port in their hands and with 3 gun dogs at their feet, when suddenly all 3 dogs pointed at the door at one end of the dining room, and with the hair of their backs on end, they followed the movement of something along the length of the room and out of the other door, after which they very slowly settled down. All 3 of the men also felt that a presence had gone through the room, although this was invisible to them, and at the time of the evening there seemed to be a very chilly atmosphere in the dining room. It has long been accepted that certain animals, and in particular most dogs, are acutely sensitive to psychic activity, and it would appear that the elegant dining room at Felbrigg may well be haunted in addition to the comparatively austere but very atmospheric library, which has seemingly been haunted for more than 100 years. Formby Coast, Merseyside. The sand dunes and foreshore west of Formby, the nearest unspoiled coastline to Liverpool, have been reputed to be haunted since time immemorial by the fearsome Old Trash, a hound whose appearance is reiterated by legendary giant dogs all over the country. The ghastly resident of Formby Beach is an immense black hound with luminous eyes, the sight of which is said to bring death or misfortune to the beholder. Belief in such hellhounds abound throughout Europe, and appear to be folk memories that date back to the days of pagan nature gods and to the old Norse mythology of the Wild Hunt and Wolf of Hell. Demon dogs, harbingers of doom, huge supernatural creatures with howls that make the blood turn cold. Surely such legendary beasts have no place in the world of today. But Old Trash, a local name derived from the noise the creature makes as it paces through the wet sand, was reportedly seen as recently as 1962 when 2 staff reporters and a photographer from a local newspaper paid a Halloween night visit to Formby Beach in search of the ghost animal. 2 of them heard and saw a huge, dark shape moving about in clear silhouette atop a nearby sand dune. As they moved forward, the strangely compelling shape began to move about in circles, much as a dog would. The watchers hurriedly climbed the high sand dune, but when they reached the top there was nothing to be seen, nor were there any footprints or any disturbance of the sand. A typical newspaper invention, perhaps. The 3 men added at the end of their report, "It is impossible to describe exactly how we felt in print, though it may easily have been a trick of the imagination, or perhaps even a stray dog. We are sincerely convinced that what we saw and heard was not of this world." Galsworth Hall, Cheshire. Galsworth Hall has several ghosts. A few years ago, the then occupants, Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Richards, told me all about the beautiful 16th century half-timbered manor house and its tilting ground formed by the Fitton family, and about the ghosts and strange happenings that have been reported there over the years. But as Raymond Richards said, all ancient houses must have unaccountable occurrences, which are difficult to explain. A dwelling cannot have occupied the same site for 900 years without acquiring some influences. Galsworth Hall is the capital house of the ancient manor of Galsworth, and we are fortunate in knowing a good deal of the history of the people who lived there since medieval times. Here, through the ages, lived the Norman Earls, the Stanhope family, the Earls of Macclesfield, the Earls of Harrington, and the Roper Richards family, each in turn being lord of the manor and patron of the living. And for more than 300 years, from 1316 to 1662, Galsworth was the home of the Fitton family, one of whom, the wayward Mary Fitton, may well have been the Dark Lady of Shakespeare's sonnets, although Dr. A.L. Rouse believes that the Dark Lady was Emilio Bassano, the wife of an Italian count. At all events, a ghostly lady is reputed to walk in the beautiful courtyard and elsewhere at Galsworth, a ghostly form described as a lady in ancient costume. In February 1971, Monica Richards, who occupied a bedroom immediately below the priest's room, complained of the smell of incense that sometimes pervaded her room. Next to the priest's room, there is an oratory with an escape hatch leading to the cellars. In 1921, a macabre discovery was made following the removal of an old cupboard, a human skeleton. The bones were later interred in the churchyard. No one has ever been able to discover whose body was hidden there, but surely no one could have wished for a more beautiful place to die. The 500-year-old mansion, now known as the Old Rectory at Galsworth, is also said to have once been the home of Mary Fitton, the charming and promiscuous 17-year-old, who so enjoyed herself when she was a member of the court of Queen Elizabeth I, the 50-year-old controller of the Queen's household, Sir William Knollys, thought himself to be in love with her. So did William Herbert, who found himself in Fleet Prison after giving her a baby and getting her sacked from the court. Her passions led her and Sir Richard Levison, an old friend of the family, to have an affair, and some say he gave her 2 children. Letters exist in which he addresses her as "my dear sweet wife." Certainly she had a child by Captain William Polwell before she eventually married him. And what of William Shakespeare, a close friend, it is said, of William Herbert? Could he, too, have fallen for the gay and bright-eyed Mary and made her immortal? Be that as it may, her ghost has long been said to walk on autumn evenings through the avenue of lime trees, from the old hall to the Harrington Arms, a countryman's inn that stands on the site of a farmhouse or lodge that Mary must have known and perhaps even used as a trysting place. It seems that when she returned from court after the birth of her son by the Earl, her mother would not allow her inside the hall, and she was forced to live at the rectory. Poor Mary had her unhappiness as well as her happiness. In 1964, the old rectory was purchased by a former Stockport alderman, Mr. Idris W. Owen. He became interested at the possibility of encountering the ghost of the amorous Mary, and he waited up no less than 8 times in the room where she is reputed to appear, but with no success. Still, he said in November of that year, "I've not given up hope of seeing her one day." He was addressing a luncheon to celebrate the opening of the Abbey National Building Society first Stockport office, attended by Sir Geoffrey Shakespeare, deputy chairman of the society and a direct descendant of the bard. He suggested that he might visit Mr. Owen's home one day, adding dryly, "The Dark Lady might put in an appearance for Shakespeare." In March 1977, my wife and I met Raymond Richards and his wife Monica, and over sherry in the beautiful ground-floor library. She told us of the ghosts and ghostly happenings at Galsworth Hall and Galsworth Old Rectory. He talked first of Mary Fitton, and learned that the ghostly figure of a girl has been seen in the vicinity of the church as well as the old rectory, the hall and the roads between. Once, a man who does odd jobs at the hall was returning very late one night when he saw a cloaked female figure which at first he thought was Mrs. Monica Richards. He saluted her, but she gave no indication that she had seen him, and carried on across the road, and he had to brake very hard to avoid hitting her. When he had stopped, he got out of his Land Rover to find no sign of her anywhere. This was about 2 a.m. in the morning. At one time, there were serious attempts to establish whether or not Mary Fitton was buried in Gawsworth Church, and before the ecclesiastical authorities stopped the investigations, a coffin was located bound with narrow leather straps decorated with a floral design, an identical design to that pictured in some portraits of this remarkable individual who deserves a ghost. Monica Richards told us that the incense had been noticed, in particular, on 3 occasions, and each time it seemed to precede the visit to the hall of an archbishop. Once the archbishop commented as he entered the hall on the thoughtfulness of the family to welcome him with incense. The family had been thinking that he must have brought it. Each time the overpowering but localized odor had been experienced by upwards of 4 people. On the last occasion, at the beginning of March 1977, it lasted only about 3 minutes, but on the previous 2 occasions it had lasted considerably longer. When the Richards had lived in the old rectory, all sorts of odd things had happened. The sound of smashing glass, a woman's voice, various raps and bangs, for which there seemed to be no logical explanation, and once Mrs. Monica Richards saw the form of a man with dark eyes and a little pointed beard. At that time her husband was busy with his book, The Manor of Gawsworth, and any visitors were directed to her, upstairs. The house is a fascinating place, full of history and interesting features, and lots of people used to call, and they were never turned away. It was after 8 o'clock, one evening, when Mrs. Richards came out of the upper room and saw a man standing at the bottom of the stairs, almost hidden in an alcove. At the time, her immediate thought was that he had left it rather late to call, and she was a little surprised that her husband had sent anyone up at that time. However, she felt that she obviously had to show the visitor her customary courtesy, and she went down the stairs towards him. Looking back on the experience afterwards, she realized that she didn't notice anything about the figure below the neck, but the face always remained very clear in her memory, and she always wanted to see him again. When she was almost up to the figure, it seemed to retreat, and at the same time she felt a sudden pain in her chest, almost like a dagger being plunged into her. By then the figure had disappeared, and she never saw it again. At one time, when they were at the old rectory, a student priest was staying with them, and after he had been there some time, Mrs. Richards chanced to comment that she hoped he liked his room and always slept well. Oddly enough, she was told, he had found that he could never sleep until 2 o'clock in the morning, so he had got into the habit of studying until the clock struck 2, and then he went to bed and always slept without difficulty. It will be remembered that the odd-job man who saw the ghost of a female found that the time was 2 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere within nearby Maggoty's Wood lie the mortal remains of Samuel Maggotty Johnson, perhaps the last professional jester in England, the eccentric 18th-century dancing master and dramatist, and his ghost haunts the spinney that bears his name. Perhaps his final jest was to be buried in unconsecrated ground to test the theory that people so buried cannot find rest and are likely to return to haunt the land of the living. If so, he seems to have been successful, for his prancing form, a dim silhouette, is seen in the vicinity of the tombstone where verses seek to justify his unusual choice of resting place. Maggotty's lion-headed fiddle, dated 1771, resides in the dining room at Gawsworth, where he lived. A visitor once found himself in Maggotty's Wood one bitterly cold winter day, and was astonished to encounter a prancing form with tight breeches, a motley coat, and a head covering resembling a monk's cowl ornamented with long ears and a coxcomb, with bells hanging from various parts of the form. Yet no sound reached the ears of the visitor, who, a moment later, found that the figure had disappeared as suddenly and as inexplicably as it had appeared. Puzzled, The visitor hesitatingly approached the spot where the form had pranced and sprung so lightly only seconds before, but there was no disturbance in the even snow that covered the ground. Another time, one of Raymond Richard's servants, a trusted and respected and responsible man, told his master that he thought he had seen someone in Maggotty's wood. He had entered the wood while he could still see someone or something springing and bounding about in the area of Johnson's grave. But when he reached the spot where the prancing form had attracted his attention, the place was totally deserted. This happened on a bright summer afternoon, and the man said the spot near Johnson's grave seemed icy cold, and he had been glad to hurry away. To the end of his life, he always remembered the odd experience, and he was never able to explain it satisfactorily. Seem to have a pardon my silence. I want to make sure these pictures are right. Them alphabetical. This doesn't seem right. Because the castle I'm supposed to talk about next does not look like that. I don't know how all of these look, but this next one doesn't seem to be. That was Galsworth Hall. Well. Oh dear. Well, let me try one more. You know what? How unusual. Because that's where I started. That's Dunvegan. Because that's the fairy flag right there. I was thinking about cutting this. Maybe I'll have to. Because I gotta get my stuff together, if you know what I'm talking about. Thank you. I think I kept it fairly professional up to this point, but I'll figure out what's going on and we'll start afresh.